It was a typical evening, the kind where I was lost in my world, scrolling through the depths of my thoughts on my phone. The screen flickered under the dim light of my bedside lamp, casting eerie shadows around the room. I was alone, totally alone. No one to answer to, no one to share my secrets with. Or so I thought. The thought crossed my mind that maybe my search history wasn't entirely private. I remember chuckling at the irony, thinking about the wild, sometimes taboo, things I searched for late at night, in the quiet hours of solitude. But then the door creaked open behind me, snapping me out of my reverie. I spun around, heart pounding, as if caught in the act. My straight nephew Mark stood there, his eyes wide, his expression a mix of confusion and something else I couldn't quite place. "Hey uncle, what are you?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart froze as I realized what he must have seen on my screen. Pictures, articles, things I'd never imagined discussing with him, my straight nephew who I thought would never understand. The silence in the room grew thick, almost suffocating, as the weight of the situation settled in. What did he think of me now? Would he judge me? Disown me? I could feel his eyes burning into my back, the screen still glowing, illuminating all my secret desires and fears. I should have closed the phone, should have hidden it away, but in that moment, I was frozen, caught in the headlights of an oncoming storm. Mark didn't say a word for what felt like an eternity. Then finally, "Why were you looking at that stuff, uncle?" His voice was so low it was barely audible, but it cut through the air like a knife. I wanted to lie, to brush it off as a mistake, but the truth was right there, staring at me from the screen, undeniable and raw. My mind raced, trying to come up with some sort of explanation, but nothing came to mind. I felt cornered, exposed. I didn't want to face this, didn't want to have this conversation with my nephew, but there he was, the embodiment of everything I'd tried to keep hidden. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. And then, just like that, he turned around and walked away, leaving me to grapple with the aftermath of my own foolishness. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay there in the darkness, replaying the moment over and over again in my mind. What would happen now? Would our relationship ever be the same? Could he ever look at me the same way again? The thought of losing him over something as trivial as my online searches was unbearable. But then again, maybe it wasn't so trivial. Maybe it was a line in the sand, a boundary that had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. As I lay there in the dark, I wondered if this was the end or just the beginning of a much bigger, more complicated story. The scene was a small, cramped dorm room, my sanctuary in the chaos of college life. It was dimly lit, the soft glow of fairy lights draped around the walls casting a warm, almost magical ambience. The room was filled with the faint scent of lavender from my diffuser, which I used to drown out the usual smells of stale pizza and laundry. It was a space I had carefully curated to be my little haven, a place where I could escape the daily grind and be myself without judgment. I had moved into the dorm just a few weeks earlier, eager to start this new chapter of my life. The walls were still bare, save for a few posters of vintage bands and abstract art I had found at the local thrift store. My bed was pushed against one wall, covered with a mismatched comforter I had brought from home. The cluttered desk in the corner held my laptop, an open textbook, and a pile of laundry that I'd been meaning to tackle for days. It was a messy but familiar place, a sanctuary of sorts where I could be free from the prying eyes of my family and peers. Mark had come over that evening because we were both in town, both excited about catching up after so long. We were close when we were kids, but we'd grown apart over the years, each of us wrapped up in our own lives. Seeing him now, sitting across from me on my bed, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for not keeping in touch. Mark was a good kid, respectful and smart, just the kind of nephew every parent dreams of. He was the typical straight guy, into sports and hanging out with his friends. I was the opposite, always more introspective, more interested in art and philosophy, more comfortable in my own head than out in the world. We chatted easily, catching up on school, family news, and our respective love lives. Mark was dating a girl named Sarah, who he seemed genuinely fond of, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy for his simplicity. He had a way of seeing the world that I sometimes envied, direct, uncomplicated, everything in its place. He was the embodiment of everything I had been trying to escape from. Yet, despite our differences, We had always been close, sharing a kind of quiet understanding that ran deeper than words. As we talked, I glanced at my phone, still open to the browser page I had been on earlier. The sight of it brought a rush of guilt and panic. How could I have been so careless? It was just a passing thought, a brief moment of foolish curiosity, but now it felt like a massive mistake. The search history displayed everything from the latest LGBTQ news articles to pornographic clips that were far removed from my usual interests. I had never meant for Mark to see any of it, but there it was, a glaring invitation to judge, to question, to expose me for what I really was. Mark didn't seem to notice, though. He was too engrossed in telling me about his classes and the latest drama with his girlfriend. I let the conversation flow, carefully avoiding the topic of my own life, of my secret searches, of the part of me I tried so hard to keep hidden. It was like walking a tightrope, trying to keep our shared history alive without revealing too much. The tension was palpable, a taut wire between us, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. And then, without warning, Mark got up to grab a drink from my mini-fridge, leaving me alone with my thoughts. In that moment, the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I was alone with my nephew, someone who had always looked up to me, and now he knew something about me that could change everything. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and terrified of what he might think of me. The fear was almost physical, a tight knot in my stomach, a chill down my spine. What was he going to say when he found out what I'd been searching for? Would he be disgusted? Disappointed? Angry? As Mark returned, his expression neutral, I plastered on a smile, trying to act like nothing was wrong. But inside, I was a bundle of nerves, my mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs. What if he said something? What if he confronted me? I couldn't stand the thought of losing him, of losing the last shred of family I had left. And yet, there it was, the truth hanging over us like a dark cloud. The tension was thick, a palpable undercurrent in our conversation, and I could feel it weighing on me, suffocating me. I had never felt so alone, so exposed. And yet, at the same time, I knew this moment was inevitable. I had always known that eventually, someone would find out about the secret part of me. I had just never expected it to be Mark. But there he was, my straight nephew, sitting across from me, his eyes innocent, his expression curious. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger story. The room felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that I couldn't quite shake. Mark was sitting across from me, his eyes flicking between my face and the phone resting on my bed. The search history, an invasive trail of websites and queries, taunted us with its presence. I had known this moment was coming, but it still hit me like a sucker punch. My stomach churned, dread pooling in my chest. I was desperate for a distraction, anything to ease the suffocating weight of this confrontation. So, what's new with Sarah? I tried, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. Mark didn't respond right away. He merely shrugged, flipping through his notes as if he was trying to avoid the topic. I don't know, just stuff, he muttered, his voice distant. There was a hardness in his eyes, an edge I hadn't seen before. The weight of the unspoken hovered in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I glanced at my phone, still sitting there, almost tauntingly. The search history was a glaring reminder of my hidden truth. I had been careful, so careful to keep this part of my life separate, but now, it was all out in the open. The tension crackled, and I could feel Mark's eyes on me, scrutinizing, assessing. My mind raced, struggling to find something to say, some way to diffuse the situation. Mark shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming a rapid rhythm on his notebook. You've been hiding something, haven't you? He finally asked, his voice low, almost accusatory. I winced, feeling caught. I wanted to deny it, to tell him there was nothing to worry about, but the words stuck in my throat. Mark didn't press, giving me a moment to find my voice. I didn't mean to keep anything from you, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. It's complicated. I could feel the lie slipping off my tongue, but Mark's eyes were hard, not buying it for a second. Mark studied me, his expression unreadable. Complicated, huh? Like what exactly? He leaned forward, his tone accusatory. I just don't get it. Why didn't you tell me? I shifted uncomfortably, trying to gather my thoughts. I don't know, I said finally, my voice shaky. I guess I was just scared. Scared of how you'd react, scared of losing you. Mark's eyes darkened, his expression furious. Scared? Of me, he shot back, his voice thick with disbelief. Why would you be scared of me? My heart was pounding in my chest, the panic rising. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I thought maybe you'd hate me. My voice cracked, the fear spilling out in one messy rush. Mark's face softened, but only for a moment. That's just it though, he said slowly. You didn't trust me enough to be honest. All those times we talked, I thought we were close, but I guess I was wrong. There was a bitterness in his words, a cutting edge that cut through me. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't know what else to do, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Mark's silence was heavy, loaded with unshed anger. You should have told me, he said finally, his voice thick with regret. But now I don't even know if I can believe anything you've said. The weight of his words settled over me like a lead blanket. I felt the full weight of my betrayal, the gulf between us stretching impossibly wide. I wanted to fix this, to take back my lies, but it was too late. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. I can't do this, Uncle, he said, his voice breaking. I can't pretend everything is okay when it's clearly not. I reached out, desperate to grab him, to make him understand. Mark, please just hear me out. I was scared, okay? I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't think you'd understand. Mark's eyes were filled with hurt, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. I don't understand, Uncle. And I don't think I ever will, he whispered, and then he was gone, leaving me sitting there, the room suddenly empty and silent. I buried my face in my hands, my heart breaking. I had lost him, all because I was too afraid to be honest. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me. I had pushed Mark away, and now I didn't know how to get him back. For the next few days, the silence was deafening. Mark didn't return my texts or calls. I saw him around campus, always at a distance, always with his friends, never alone. It was like I didn't exist. I couldn't concentrate on anything, my mind constantly circling back to that moment, to the look on Mark's face when I told him the truth. And then, just as suddenly, Mark showed up in my dorm room. I was staring at the walls, feeling utterly defeated when he knocked on the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed to open it, my mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs. Mark stood there, his expression guarded. I didn't know what to say, he admitted, his voice low. I was angry, I guess. But I don't hate you, Uncle. I don't understand. Tears pricked at my eyes, relief flooding through me. Thank God, Mark, I whispered, stepping aside to let him in. I'm so sorry, Mark. I should have told you the truth from the start. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping. I don't get it all, Uncle, but I want to try. I want to understand. A lump formed in my throat, a mixture of fear and hope. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for being here, I said, my voice shaky. Mark nodded, his expression uncertain. I guess we've got a lot to figure out, he said softly. I smiled, a small, shaky smile. Yeah, we do, I agreed. But we'll get through this, Mark. I promise. And with that, the tension between us slowly began to ease. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but there was a flicker of hope there, a fragile bond that I was determined to rebuild. Mark was still angry, still hurt, but there was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Mark stayed a little longer, and we talked. We didn't solve everything in that one conversation, but it was a start. Mark listened as I explained, stumbling over my words, trying to make him understand everything I had kept hidden. And Mark, bless him, he tried. He asked questions, his curiosity outweighing his anger, and slowly, the pieces started to fall into place. It's not just physical, is it? He asked, his voice tentative. It's more than that. I nodded, my heart in my throat. Yeah, Mark. It's about feeling something deeper. About loving someone, even when you know it might not be accepted. Mark was quiet for a moment, processing this new information. I don't get it all, Uncle, he admitted finally. But I want to try. I want to be there for you. Tears stung my eyes, and I pulled him into a tight hug. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for trying. The tension between us had broken, the air in the room lighter. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Mark still had questions, still didn't fully understand, but he was willing to learn. And for now, that was enough. As Mark left the room a few hours later, there was a new lightness to his step, a newfound respect for me that I never thought possible. I watched him go, a mix of pride and relief swelling in my chest. We still had a long way to go, but I knew we were on the right path. And as I sat there alone once again, I couldn't help but smile. Maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay after all. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, a heavy silence hanging in the air. The secrets that the protagonist had been desperately trying to keep hidden were about to be exposed. The protagonist's heart raced, knowing that Mark was about to uncover the truth. The confrontation was inevitable, and there was no escaping it. Mark's face betrayed his mounting anxiety, his eyes darkening with suspicion. The protagonist's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no way to avoid the impending explosion. The moment of revelation was brutal. Mark's eyes widened as he picked up the phone, his fingers trembling as he unlocked it and found the incriminating search history. The hurt and betrayal in Mark's eyes were almost unbearable to witness. The air seemed to freeze as Mark's shock turned into fury. He confronted the protagonist, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. The accusations were sharp and cutting, each word a blow to the protagonist's already shattered heart. Mark's betrayal was palpable, his feelings of betrayal and deceit mingling with a raw vulnerability that the protagonist had never seen before. The confrontation escalated, each exchange more heated than the last. The protagonist's attempts to explain were weak, their words caught in a chokehold of fear and shame. Mark's anger was incandescent, a storm raging inside him as he struggled to come to terms with the revelation. The protagonist's attempts to defend themselves fell flat, only fueling Mark's anger further. It was a clash of emotions, the protagonist's vulnerability clashing with Mark's betrayal. The tension was almost unbearable, the air crackling with unspoken accusations and unvoiced fears. The moment of choice was excruciating. Mark's anger reached its peak, his voice trembling with raw emotion. He confronted the protagonist with a demand: either come clean and work towards reconciliation or walk away. The ultimatum was a knife to the protagonist's heart, forcing them to confront the full extent of their deceit. The protagonist's heart pounded, the weight of their actions crashing down on them. In that moment, the decision felt almost impossible. Mark's anger was palpable, a storm of betrayal and hurt that seemed insurmountable. The protagonist's plea for forgiveness was weak, their voice breaking with the depth of their regret. But Mark's response was a surprise. Instead of walking away, he stayed. The decision was tentative, almost reluctant, but it was a choice nonetheless. There was a glimmer of empathy in Mark's eyes, a recognition of the struggle that the protagonist had been hiding. It was a fragile truce, a beginning of a long journey towards healing. The protagonist's heart ached with a mixture of relief and guilt. The immediate conflict had been resolved, but the emotional fallout was far from over. The protagonist and Mark were left to grapple with the aftermath, each struggling to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. There were still so many unresolved issues, so many lingering doubts and fears. The reconciliation was awkward, a tentative truce between them. The tension was still there, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had almost torn them apart. The protagonist's guilt was overwhelming, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. Mark's anger had not entirely dissipated, his hurt still raw. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a slow and painful process of rebuilding trust and understanding. The protagonist was haunted by their past actions, the weight of their deceit a constant presence in their mind. The dynamic between them had changed, each struggling to redefine their roles in the relationship. But the story wasn't over. There were still so many challenges ahead, unresolved issues simmering beneath the surface. Mark's decision to stay wasn't a complete resolution, but rather a beginning of a long journey towards healing. The protagonist's past actions continued to cast a shadow over their present, creating new conflicts that would have to be faced. The story set the stage for the next climax, planting seeds of doubt and fear for the future. Mark's anger, though subdued, was still there, a reminder of the pain that had almost destroyed them. The protagonist's lingering guilt was a constant presence, a battle against shame that they would have to face. The story was about more than just the immediate conflict. It was about personal growth and redemption, the journey towards healing and forgiveness. The protagonist and Mark had a long road ahead, each struggling with their own demons. The story hinted at more challenges, teasing the audience with the complexities of their relationship. The emotional fallout was far from over, and the tension would continue to simmer. But for now, there was a fragile truce, a tentative beginning. The story was just starting, and there was so much more to come. What would the future hold for them? That was the question hanging in the air, a tantalizing mystery that the audience was eager to see unfold. The aftermath of the confrontation was a period of intense self-reflection for the protagonist. Every conversation, every glance from Mark, felt heavy with unsaid words. The initial relief from the immediate conflict had been replaced by a deeper sense of turmoil. The protagonist's guilt was overwhelming, a constant presence that colored every interaction. The shame of their deceit was like a lead weight on their chest, making it hard to breathe. They could see the hurt in Mark's eyes, a pain that wasn't going away. The protagonist's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: regret, shame, anger, and a desperate desire for redemption. Mark's anger didn't just fade away. It simmered beneath the surface, a reminder of the betrayal and deceit. Every attempt to apologize seemed futile. The protagonist's words felt inadequate, unable to convey the depth of their remorse. Mark's silence was deafening, a barrier between them that felt impossible to cross. The protagonist struggled with the weight of their actions, torn between the desire to make things right and the fear of pushing Mark further away. It was a constant tug-of-war, the protagonist's guilt and shame at odds with their hope for forgiveness. They were learning the hard way that apologies weren't enough to repair what had been broken. The strain on their relationship was palpable. Every interaction felt charged, each word laden with unspoken emotions. The protagonist and Mark's once easy camaraderie was now tinged with unease. Conversations were stilted, awkward silences hanging between them like a fog. The protagonist felt like they were walking on eggshells, afraid of saying the wrong thing and reigniting Mark's anger. The dynamic had shifted, the balance of their relationship disrupted. The protagonist's struggle for forgiveness was met with a mix of skepticism and wariness from Mark. Every gesture of goodwill felt forced, a desperate attempt to mend something that seemed beyond repair. The protagonist found solace in their own company. They retreated into their thoughts, trying to make sense of their actions and the fallout. Nights were spent tossing and turning, the memories of their deceit haunting their sleep. The protagonist's mind was a maelstrom of regret, the weight of their actions impossible to escape. They were consumed by guilt, a self-imposed punishment for their betrayal. The pain of knowing they had hurt someone they cared about was almost unbearable. The protagonist's isolation was a coping mechanism, a way to protect themselves from the pain of their own making. But it also meant they were unable to fully reach out to Mark, leaving their relationship stuck in a painful stalemate. Mark's silence was a wall between them, a barrier that seemed impossible to break down. The protagonist's attempts to reach out were met with cool indifference, their words falling flat. It was like trying to cross a desert. Every step forward seemed to take them further away from each other. The protagonist's desperation to fix things only made Mark's anger worse. There was a painful irony in the situation. The protagonist's attempts to make amends only seemed to drive a deeper wedge between them. The gulf between them grew with each passing day, the emotional distance widening with every interaction. It was a painful lesson in the limits of forgiveness, a reminder that some wounds were too deep to heal. The protagonist's self-reflection led to a painful realization: they had been living a lie. Their deception wasn't just about hiding their true desires, it was about living inauthentically. The protagonist had been hiding from themselves, afraid to confront their own truths. This confrontation with their past actions was a brutal awakening, forcing them to confront their own fears and insecurities. The pain of this self-discovery was like a punch to the gut, a reminder of how far they had strayed from their true self. The protagonist was left grappling with a deeper identity crisis, a realization that they needed to change if they were ever to repair their relationship with Mark. Mark's anger was a reflection of the protagonist's own fears and insecurities. It was a mirror, showing them the consequences of their actions. The protagonist's struggle to make amends was met with a mix of resistance and pain from Mark. But there was also a flicker of vulnerability in Mark's eyes, a hint that there was still something worth saving. The protagonist's self-reflection became a process of growth and change. They began to see their own actions more clearly, acknowledging the hurt they had caused. The protagonist's journey towards redemption was painful and slow, a process of peeling away layers of guilt and shame to find a more authentic self. The relationship wasn't completely beyond repair. There was still a spark between them, a flicker of something worth saving. The protagonist's journey towards healing was about more than just repairing their relationship with Mark. It was about finding a way to live authentically, to stop hiding from their true self. The protagonist's self-reflection led to a deeper understanding of their own desires and needs, a realization that they could no longer live a lie. The process was painful, but it was also a journey towards self-acceptance. The protagonist's struggle for forgiveness was intertwined with their struggle to reconcile their past actions with their true self. In the end, the story wasn't just about a confrontation or a betrayal. It was about growth and redemption, about finding a way forward despite the pain. The protagonist's journey was a painful but necessary one, forcing them to confront their own truths. The relationship with Mark was far from over, but there was a glimmer of hope. The protagonist's self-reflection had opened a door to change, a chance for growth and healing. The story left viewers with a sense of unresolved tension, a promise of more to come. What would the future hold for the protagonist and Mark? That was the question lingering in the air, a tantalizing mystery that left the audience eager for more. The second turning point in this narrative was the most intense and emotionally charged moment of all. It arrived without warning, escalating the tension to an unbearable peak. The protagonist had begun to believe they were making progress, inching closer to some form of reconciliation with Mark. They had started to open up, sharing their deepest fears and feelings, hoping it would help bridge the gap between them. But all that progress was shattered in a single, explosive confrontation that changed everything. The protagonist was alone in their room, going through their search history on their laptop, when Mark barged in without knocking. There was an angry fire in Mark's eyes, his face contorted with rage. The air was thick with an unspoken accusation. "How could you?" Mark's voice was low and cold, his words dripping with betrayal. The protagonist's heart plummeted. They had hoped the past few days of tentative reconciliation had paved the way to forgiveness, but this raw, unfiltered anger was a punch to the gut. Mark didn't need to say much for the protagonist to understand the full impact of their actions. Mark's eyes were accusing, filled with a mix of anger, hurt, and disappointment. The protagonist's attempts to explain fell flat, their words twisted in desperation. "It's not what you think," they stammered, but Mark's face remained hard, a wall between them. The protagonist's mind raced, every memory, every lie playing out like a loop. They were cornered, the full weight of their betrayal crashing down on them. Mark's accusations cut deep, each word a sharp blade. "How long have you been hiding this?" Mark demanded, his voice a taut coil of emotion. The protagonist's mind flashed back to the moment they first started hiding their true self. They could see the hurt in Mark's eyes, the shock and betrayal that came with the revelation. The protagonist's chest tightened, the guilt unbearable. They tried to speak, to explain, but the words were stuck in their throat. It was like trying to reason with a storm, futile, chaotic, and overwhelming. The confrontation escalated, Mark's anger boiling over. "I thought we were friends," Mark snarled, his words a slap in the face. The protagonist's heart felt like it was being ripped apart. They had never intended to hurt Mark, never meant for their actions to lead to this. "I'm sorry," they managed, their voice cracking. But Mark wasn't interested in apologies. "Sorry isn't enough," he shot back, his words filled with a raw, almost primal rage. The protagonist's eyes stung with unshed tears, the pain of their betrayal stark and overwhelming. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Mark's eyes were like chips of ice, his anger palpable. The protagonist's chest felt tight, the reality of what they had done sinking in. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," Mark finally whispered, his voice breaking. The words hit the protagonist like a physical blow. They had never felt so lost, so broken. The protagonist's mind raced, trying to find some way to make things right, to undo the damage. But it was too late. Mark was already walking away, his retreating figure a final, painful rejection. The protagonist was left alone in the aftermath, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. The room felt cold and empty, echoing with the harsh reality of their betrayal. The protagonist's heart was a lead weight, their mind a blur of confusion and regret. They had thought they were making progress, but this moment shattered all those hopes. The protagonist's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, shame, anger, all mingling into a toxic mix. They had lost something important, something precious, and it felt like it could never be recovered. The protagonist's desperation to make things right only made things worse. They chased after Mark, their words a frantic plea for forgiveness. But Mark's silence was deafening, a barrier that seemed impossible to break down. The protagonist's heart ached with the realization that they might have lost their friend forever. "Please just listen," they begged, their voice raw with emotion. But Mark didn't stop, didn't turn around. The protagonist's heart sank, the loss of Mark's friendship like a heavy, crushing weight. The confrontation had shattered the fragile peace that had started to grow between them. The protagonist's world was spinning, the reality of their actions sinking in. They were a mess of guilt and shame, their mind a whirl of confusion. The protagonist's heartache was palpable, a raw, aching wound. The realization of their betrayal was almost unbearable, the pain a constant presence. They had never felt so alone, so lost. The protagonist's desperation was a raw, painful thing, a futile attempt to fix something that seemed beyond repair. The protagonist's self-reflection was a brutal process. They could see the full impact of their actions now, the way their lies and deceit had hurt Mark. The pain was like a physical blow, a harsh reality check. The protagonist's guilt was overwhelming, a suffocating weight. They had been living a lie, hiding their true self from the world, and now it had cost them their friendship. The protagonist's mind was a blur of emotions, regret, shame, anger, all mingling into a toxic mix. They had betrayed something precious, something irreplaceable, and it felt like they were paying the price for it. Mark's silence was a wall between them, a barrier that seemed impossible to break down. The protagonist's attempts to reach out were met with cold indifference. Every word felt like it was falling on deaf ears. The protagonist's desperation was almost unbearable, their heart a constant ache. They had lost something important, something that had taken years to build. The protagonist's self-reflection led to a painful realization: they had been hiding from their true self for too long. The pain of this self-discovery was almost too much to bear, a harsh reminder of the cost of their lies. The confrontation had changed everything. The protagonist's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, a chaotic mix of guilt, shame, and regret. They had lost something precious, something irreplaceable, and it was a bitter, painful pill to swallow. The protagonist's self-reflection was a brutal process, forcing them to confront their own fears and insecurities. They had been living a lie, hiding from their true self, and now it had cost them their friendship. The protagonist's journey towards redemption was painful and slow, a process of peeling away layers of guilt and shame to find a more authentic self. The second turning point had left the protagonist grappling with the full impact of their actions, a painful but necessary awakening. The air in the room was thick with unresolved tension as Mark stormed out, leaving the protagonist standing in the aftermath of their shattered relationship. The protagonist's heart ached with a mix of regret and longing, their mind racing with 1,000 questions and what-ifs. How had things spiraled out of control so quickly? Could they ever fix this? The silence in the room was deafening, a stark reminder of the gulf that now lay between them. The protagonist's eyes filled with tears as they replayed the events over and over in their mind. They had thought they were making progress, inching closer to understanding and acceptance. But now, it felt like all that progress had been for nothing. The protagonist's self-reflection was a painful, harsh process. They could see the full impact of their actions now, the way their lies and deceit had hurt Mark. The realization was almost unbearable, a harsh reminder of the cost of their fear and shame. But even as the protagonist was consumed by their guilt, there was a glimmer of hope. The confrontation with Mark had brought everything to the surface, forcing the protagonist to confront their true self and the pain they had been avoiding. It was a painful awakening, but also a necessary one. The protagonist's journey towards redemption was slow and painful, but the seed of change had been planted. They knew they had to find a way to make things right, to rebuild the trust and connection that had been so abruptly shattered. And that was the cliffhanger. The protagonist was left standing at a crossroads, their future uncertain. Could they find a way to make amends? Could they rebuild the trust and understanding they had lost? The questions hung in the air, teasing the possibility of a new beginning. The protagonist's journey was far from over, but the path ahead was fraught with challenges and uncertainties. It was a call to action for the audience. What would they do in the protagonist's place? How would they navigate the pain and fear of a relationship gone wrong? The protagonist's story was a universal one, a reflection of the struggles we all face in our relationships. It was a reminder that redemption and healing are possible, even in the darkest moments. So, as the screen fades to black, the audience is left with questions. What would they do? How would they find their way back to the ones they love? The protagonist's story was a call to action, urging viewers to confront their own fears and insecurities, to take the first step towards healing and forgiveness. And with that, the screen fades to black, leaving the audience eager for more. The protagonist's journey is far from over, but it has just begun. What happens next? The story may have ended, but the journey is just beginning. So, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Stay tuned for the next chapter in the protagonist's journey. And let me know what you think in the comments below. What would you have done in their place? The call to action is clear. Share your thoughts, engage with the story, and join the conversation.